All right, so today we're diving into negotiation,
Yeah,
which is a pretty fascinating topic in and of itself.
absolutely.
And we've got this source, Negotiated Like a Pro, English communication skills that you sent over. And I love how it's actually structured like a podcast script.
Yeah, it is.
It's really cool.
Yeah, it's a very clever approach, I think, to kind of get the information across in a way that's easy to digest and apply, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that even though it's, geared towards English specifically,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these concepts apply no matter what language you're speaking.
Absolutely. I think the fundamentals of negotiation transcend any language barrier.
Right. And so we're going to assume our listener, already knows what bargaining is and, what compromise is.
Right.
But we want to take it a step further today.
Yeah, definitely. I think we can delve into those subtle tactics and strategies that really can make the difference.
Right. Like how to really use those concepts to your advantage. Now, the source talks about avoiding getting ripped off abroad, which is something I know we all worry about when we travel.
It's a common concern for sure.
But beyond those specific situations, why are negotiation skills so important in everyday life?
Well, you think about it, almost every interaction we have where we're trying to reach some sort of agreement has elements of negotiation in it.
That's true.
Whether it's something as simple as deciding where to go to dinner with friends or, something as complex as a salary negotiation with your boss.
Right. I know I've definitely had those moments where I've walked away from a conversation thinking, man, I could handle that better.
Oh, we've all been there, I think. But the important thing to remember is that effective negotiation, it's not about, being manipulative or aggressive.
Right.
It's really about understanding kind of the psychology that's at play, communicating clearly and finding solutions that actually benefit everyone involved.
So it's more of a collaborative dance than a wrestling match.
Exactly. Yeah. I like that analogy.
And like any dance, it takes a certain amount of finesse.
Absolutely. And that's where understanding some of these key terms and phrases can really give you an edge.
Right.
The source, for example, highlights the concept of leverage.
Leverage. Okay, so having something that gives you an advantage.
Right.
But how do you actually pinpoint that and use that in a real negotiation?
Well, I think it starts with information.
Okay.
The more you know about the other party's needs and their motivations, what their constraints are, the better equipped you are to identify potential leverage points.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, you're negotiating the price of a used car and you find out that the seller is moving overseas soon.
Oh, that's a good piece of information.
Right. They're probably under some time pressure to sell.
Yeah.
Which gives you a little bit more leverage to potentially negotiate a better price.
So it's not just about information. Then it can also be about your own, resources or expertise, even your reputation.
Exactly.
Like if I'm known as someone who can close a deal really fast, that could be a form of leverage.
Absolutely. It adds to your credibility and can influence, how willing the other party is to make concessions.
Now, the source also goes into some essential vocabulary.
Yes.
Like win-win and deadlock.
Right. Terms that we hear a lot but maybe don't always fully grasp the nuances of.
Yeah, let's unpack those a little bit.
Okay, so a win-win scenario is pretty self-explanatory.
Right.
It's an outcome where both parties walk away feeling like they got a fair deal.
Okay.
It's about, meeting everyone's needs to a reasonable degree.
Okay.
Now, deadlock, on the other hand, is less ideal.
Yeah, that sounds less ideal.
That's where the negotiation stalls because neither side is willing to budge.
Right. Okay, I can picture that.
It's like, two rams butting heads and nothing's moving forward.
And that's where I'm guessing a strong BT&A comes in.
You got it.
Okay.
Your BAT&A, which stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement,
Right.
is essentially your backup plan. Knowing what you'll do if you can't reach an agreement gives you the confidence to walk away if the terms aren't favorable.
So it's like having a safety net so you don't feel pressured to accept a bad deal.
Exactly. It empowers you to negotiate from a position of strength.
I like that.
Now, the source actually provides a really handy script with phrases for every stage of a negotiation.
Oh, perfect. Because I feel like, sometimes I don't even know what to say.
Right.
It
can be helpful to have those go-to phrases.
Yeah. What are some good ways to open a negotiation to set the right tone?
Well, the source emphasizes keeping it pretty simple and direct.
Okay.
Phrases like, I'd like to propose a deal, or let's discuss the terms. These clearly signal your intention to negotiate, but they also, maintain a professional tone.
Right. You're not beating around the bush.
Exactly.
But what about when it comes to actually making an offer?
Right.
How do you find that sweet spot between being assertive and being overly aggressive?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
I think the key is to be clear and confident without shutting down the conversation.
Oh, okay.
Phrases like, we're willing to offer X for the project, or our budget for this is Y.
Mm-hmm.
These can set a firm starting point while still leaving room for discussion.
Okay, that's good. And I like the we.
Yes.
Framing it as a we makes me feel a little more powerful somehow.
It can create a sense of, a united front.
Yes.
Now, what if you need more information before you can even make an offer?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Right. Don't hesitate to ask for clarification.
Okay.
Phrases like, can you elaborate on that point? Or what exactly is included in that proposal?
Mm-hmm.
These ensure that you fully understand the situation before you put your cards on the table.
Right. It's better to ask those questions up front than regret it later.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you have to be flexible, right? How do you kind of communicate that you're open to compromise without sounding weak?
Right. Well, the source suggests phrases like, we're open to exploring other options. Or, let's brainstorm some alternative solutions.
Mm-hmm.
These convey flexibility while still maintaining your commitment to finding that mutually beneficial outcome.
Right. It shows that you're willing to work together.
Exactly.
Not just dictate terms.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got to seal the deal.
Right.
How do you close the negotiations smoothly and confidently?
Again, I think clarity and conciseness are key.
Okay.
Phrases like, I think we have an agreement, or let's shape on it.
Mm-hmm.
These signal that you're ready to finalize the deal and move forward.
Perfect. So we've covered essential vocabulary phrases for every stage of a negotiation and the importance of leverage in BTNA.
Yeah, we've laid a good foundation.
But I have a feeling there's more to it than that,
Oh, there's definitely more.
especially when it comes to those subtle psychological tactics.
You're right, and that's where we get into those advanced negotiation strategies that the source talks about, things like anchoring, mirroring, and even using silence strategically.
Right.
These can give you a significant advantage.
Let's explore those further in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, sounds good.
All right, so we're back, and we're ready to dive into these advanced negotiation strategies.
Yes.
And I got to say, I'm really fascinated by this idea of using silence strategically,
Yeah.
because I feel like I would just want to fill the void with awkward chatter,
It can be tough,
Yeah.
but silence is a powerful tool.
Okay.
Imagine this. You've just presented your offer, and the other party seems hesitant.
Yeah.
Instead of, immediately jumping in and making concessions, try a well-placed pause.
So you're giving them the space to think.
Exactly.
Maybe come up with a counteroffer that's better for you.
Yeah, sometimes silence can create this sense of anticipation and subtly shift the power dynamic.
Interesting. Okay.
The source also mentions anchoring as an effective tactic.
Right. Anchoring. So setting the initial expectation.
Okay.
If you're selling something, you start with a higher asking price. But isn't there a risk of turning people off if you anchor too high?
Yeah, there's definitely a balance to strike.
Oh.
Anchoring too aggressively can backfire. But a well-placed anchor can subtly influence the other party's perception of value.
Okay.
So let's say you're negotiating a salary for a new job.
Okay.
Instead of just stating your desired salary, you could frame it by saying something like, based on my experience and the market rate for this role, I'm looking for a salary in the range of X to Y.
So you're basically anchoring them to a higher range.
Exactly.
Even if you would take something lower.
Exactly. It sets a frame of reference that can work in your favor.
Oh, that's clever.
Now, mirroring is another interesting technique, although it's a little bit more
The mirror, I feel like I've read about that before.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like subtly reflecting their body language.
Right.
Or their speech patterns to build rapport.
Exactly. The idea is that by subconsciously mimicking their behavior, you create a sense of connection and trust.
Oh.
So, for example, if they tend to use certain phrases or, speak at a particular pace, you might subtly adapt your own communication style to align with theirs.
So it's not about copying them.
Right.
It's more about finding a harmony.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about creating this sense of shared understanding and comfort,
Okay.
which can make them more receptive to your proposals.
Interesting. The source doesn't really go into the psychology of that,
Yeah.
but I imagine it has something to do with people wanting to belong.
Right. There's research that suggests that, we tend to like people who are similar to us.
Right.
And so even these subtle cues of mirroring can actually create that sense of liking and trust.
Okay, so we've talked about these psychological tactics. What about real-world examples.
Sure.
Does the source give any, like, actual examples of how this plays out?
It does. It covers a range of scenarios, from salary negotiations and business deals to everyday situations like, deciding on a restaurant with friends or splitting chores with roommates.
I'm always curious about, like, those high-stakes business negotiations you see in the movies.
Oh, yeah.
Are those even remotely accurate?
Well, Hollywood obviously tends to dramatize things.
Right, of course.
But I think the underlying principles are often sound.
Okay.
Remember that scene in The Social Network where Mark Zuckerberg's negotiating with the Winklevoss twins?
Oh, yeah.
He uses a lot of these strategic pauses, these subtle power plays. It's like a chess match.
It is. He's very calculated.
Right. And he also demonstrates a very clear understanding of his leverage and their BTNA, which ultimately allows him to dictate the terms of the deal.
So even though it's fictionalized,
Right.
it still highlights those core negotiation principles.
Absolutely.
And, even though most of us won't be negotiating billion-dollar deals,
Right.
those same principles apply to those smaller everyday interactions.
Absolutely. Every conversation where you're trying to reach an agreement has elements of negotiation.
That's true. Whether I'm trying to get my kids to eat their vegetables
Exactly.
or negotiate a raise,
Yeah.
it's all the same.
It's all negotiation.
I think my favorite example from the source is the story about the guy who negotiated his ransom down via WhatsApp.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about high stakes.
That's the ultimate test
It is.
of your negotiation skills.
What phrases did he use? What leverage did he find?
Right.
It's amazing.
It's an incredible story that really highlights the power of, staying calm, thinking strategically, and leveraging every resource you have, even under pressure.
Even under extreme pressure.
Yeah. And, while the source doesn't go into the specific tactics he used,
Right.
I think it's safe to assume that he employed many of the principles that we've been discussing.
It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, some pretty advanced tactics and some pretty inspiring examples. But I think it's also important to talk about the pitfalls.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are the things that people do that can really mess up a negotiation?
Avoiding common mistakes is just as crucial as mastering effective techniques.
Right.
And the source dedicates a whole section to this, to common mistakes to avoid.
Okay.
And I think topping that list is inadequate preparation.
Yeah. It's like going into battle without a plan.
Exactly. Before entering any negotiation, take the time to, clearly define your goals. Research the other party's position, anticipate potential objections.
Okay.
And develop a strong BTNA.
So know yourself, know your opponent.
Exactly.
Have a game plan.
Have a game plan.
Okay. What other negotiation sins are there?
Well, another common pitfall is talking too much and not listening enough.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Remember, negotiation is a two-way street.
Right.
It's not just about presenting your case. It's also about actively listening to the other party, understanding their perspective, and identifying potential areas of compromise.
So it's about gathering information, not just giving a monologue.
Exactly.
Right on.
Being too rigid is another one.
Okay.
Flexibility is key to finding creative solutions.
Right. If you're not willing to budge at all,
Yeah.
you're going to get stuck.
You're likely to hit a deadlock.
Right. And the source also cautions against focusing too much on price.
Yes.
Obviously, price is important.
It is often a major factor.
Yeah.
But there are other terms, like delivery time, payment schedules, or even additional services that can be just as important.
Right. You got to look at the whole picture.
Exactly.
You just get stuck on one number.
Exactly.
Right.
And finally, perhaps the most important point is to keep your emotions in check.
Yeah.
Losing your cool will only undermine your position and make it harder to reach a mutually beneficial agreement.
Right. Don't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions.
Right. Exactly. Staying calm and collected allows you to think clearly and make rational choices even under pressure.
Right. Because when you're emotional, you don't think straight.
Exactly.
So negotiation's a process.
It is.
It takes patience, understanding, a willingness to find that common ground.
Absolutely. Now the source goes on to discuss.
It really is as much about managing yourself as it is, the other person.
Absolutely. Emotional intelligence is a huge part of effective negotiation.
Well, I'm feeling a lot more confident after this deep dive.
That's great to hear.
I feel like you've given me some new tools to use in my next negotiation.
Excellent.
So what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from today?
Well, the source really emphasizes this point that anyone can become a skilled negotiator.
Right.
It's not some like innate talent that only a few people are born with.
Right. It's something you can learn.
Exactly. With practice and the right mindset, anyone can improve their negotiation skills.
And we have opportunities to practice this almost every day, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Every interaction where we're trying to reach some sort of agreement, whether it's, what to have for dinner or a major business deal, it's all a chance to hone our skills.
So it's kind of like learning a new language or a musical instrument.
It is. The more you do it, the better you get.
So now the source we've been talking about, it's specifically geared towards English. But I'm curious, how universal are these principles? Do they apply across cultures?
That's a great question. And I think while the specific tactics and the nuances of communication might vary from culture to culture,
right,
the fundamental principles, things like preparation, leverage, communication, emotional intelligence, these are pretty universal.
So no matter where you are in the world or who you're negotiating with,
right,
these are a good starting point.
Absolutely. Of course, it's always wise to be mindful of cultural differences.
Yeah.
And, adapt your approach accordingly.
Of course.
For instance, in some cultures, direct communication is very much appreciated, whereas in others, a more indirect approach might be more effective.
So it's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Between the universal and what's culturally appropriate.
Absolutely.
All right, so before we wrap up today, I want to leave our listener with a little challenge.
I like it.
Inspired by what we've been talking about. I want you to think about a negotiation that's coming up for you.
Okay.
It could be something small, it could be something big.
Right.
And think about how you can apply what we've learned today to make it successful.
I love that it's not just about absorbing the information, it's about putting it into action.
Exactly. So we're helping our listeners become expert negotiators themselves.
That's the goal.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. I feel so much more prepared to tackle my next negotiation.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Likewise, so to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into negotiation.
Yes, thank you.
And remember, the power to negotiate. Effectively, it's in your hands. We'll see you next time.